People are encouraged sometimes by their mobile carriers or by vendors to install antivirus or anti-malware on their smartphone. And from what we see in the marketplace and in testing apps and talking to our corporate customers and working with the government, we believe, and we're not the only researchers who say this, by far there are other issues that pose a much more significant risk due to the prevalence of these issues and the probability that a person will be affected by these issues. So we see vulnerable apps constantly putting data at risk. We've done continuous testing of mobile apps in the marketplace going back to 2011. Our study between last year and this year of 100 apps found a substantial number that still have man-in-the-middle vulnerabilities or store the password locally or transmit without SSL. And those vulnerabilities can range from transmitting data insecurely or storing it insecurely to worse issues such as having a content provider on Android that enables your data to be requested by other apps, or storing your data insecurely on the SD card. I'll share just a quick example of an app vulnerability. Evernote's a popular app. Lots of people use it. It's definitely a productivity accelerator. But when we took a look at it, I think there's sort of an expectation by a lot of users that Evernote would keep your note data private. And what we found on Android in the version we tested was that note data was being stored on the SD card. If you're familiar with the Android security model, going back quite a while, the SD card is sort of the Wild West, and any data stored there in versions 4.0 and earlier, any app could read the SD card without asking for any permissions. So any data being stored there was really wide open to any app to grab and upload to a server. Even in the newest versions of Android, where you have some attempted controls on what data an app can access on the SD card, you still have the possibility of someone grabbing it and popping the SD card out and simply reading it, and that's not preventable. So, long story short, in that particular app, any data you would store in those notes would have been substantially vulnerable to being read, and it's just an example of how use of everyday, common, popular apps presents some risk to your data. It's certainly not the only example. It's just one that affects, I think, an app that a lot of people use. Fail on iOS, which undermined SSL encryption, basically certificate validation for all apps on iOS, undermining the very network encryption that we've relied on for decades to secure web traffic. On Android, on pretty much every version and every handset that's ever been released, you have different vulnerabilities either in the system apps put on by the carrier or in the kernel itself, the Android kernel, that enables users, or in some cases malicious applications, to try to get root access. And a quick example there, a recent root exploit for the Galaxy S5 came out. So you've got one of the most popular devices ever, you've got a very new version of Android, and a root exploit came out that enabled users who wanted to install Cyanogen or other third-party versions of Android on the phone to root it. But when they did, and they installed a super user type application that's supposed to control, or actually the exploit itself didn't install any application to control what would get root access. So users who rooted that device, the Galaxy S5 for instance, using this new technique, as soon as they did that, any application on the device that they would have there could request root privileges and automatically get those privileges without any approval by the user. So those folks who choose to mod their Android, if they were using that technique, were at significant risk. Going back, as long as we've been using laptops, but especially with these phones, you can easily misplace your device. I think our CEO Andrew Hogue has lost on the order of a dozen mobile devices over time in cabs and so on. And you hope somebody's going to just try to find the owner and return it. But back here in reality, before somebody goes to resell it, they may try to harvest the data from it. And the app storing data without additional encryption really puts that data at risk if the user's not using a strong passcode. So you have to look at what data is being stored in terms of corporate data or sensitive personal data that you wouldn't want disclosed if you lost control of your device. And I think sometimes folks overestimate just how much technical skill is required to get to that data, especially when you get into a little bit older versions of iOS, the iPhone 4. You talk about versions of Android 4.0 and below. Really a lot of common ways out there, free techniques published to bypass passcodes and get at the data on these devices. And then at the bottom of the list we have malware. If as an end user you are consuming apps only from the official stores from iTunes and Google Play, and you're very judicious about what you install, your risk from malware is not zero, but it's really not a very high percentage. So when we talk about antivirus, you're talking about a security technique on desktop that is as old as most people's use of computers, listening on the phone in business. And the technique is based on reacting to what we've seen before. So, hey, there's a piece of malware, malicious software out there that uses a certain snippet of code, a certain way of trying to get access or additional privileges on a device, or a certain way of infecting or transmitting itself, and let's look for that technique, that piece of code being used again. And the evidence on mobile is different in terms of how the OS isolates applications, and the evidence is that finding signatures of malicious code on mobile is really not effective. It's reached the point, and the second bullet point, he's not even only talking about mobile, actually. When the senior VP from Symantec said antivirus is dead, he was talking about all antivirus. I'm not recommending that folks go and uninstall their antivirus from their PC. It's sort of a lowest common denominator. You would not want to fall victim to some 3-year-old malware that's just out there. But is that going to catch an advanced technique or a new threat? It's really not going to. And especially on mobile, we'll talk on another question about how difficult it is to try to catch those sneaky bits of code on mobile. So obfuscation is the practice of running source code at compile time through an obfuscator to make it more difficult to identify what's happening. And you can go to quite a degree with obfuscation. You can even implement encryption of code and store the key within the code itself. You had for a while in both iOS and Android, you had dynamic code loading, where an app would load a certain set of code, but it had the ability to reach out to a server and download additional code after the fact. So any scanning done at install time or even in the App Store would not catch all the capabilities of the app. So those are two ways that we observed over time. You can also use native code. So we're all familiar, or many people are familiar with the fact that Android apps are written in Java and then they're compiled into this APK. Well, in fact, Android apps aren't only written in Java. You can write the code in C, in very low-level code, and you can apply quite a bit of obfuscation to that code and simply compile that into the APK. So analyzing things at a Java level is not going to identify all that an app does at the lowest level. And so what an attacker can do, or a malicious developer can do if they want to hide what an app does. They can change the code substantially, even if it's a technique that's sort of been seen before. They can apply that heavy obfuscation. They can put it into native code and make it very hard to detect. So there was a study done by Northwestern and NC State where they created this Droid Chameleon, which applied different malicious techniques, and they ran it through a variety of the anti-malware scanners for Android to see what they would catch. And what they found was that when they used really simple evasion techniques, so as trivial as changing the name of the APK or applying really minimal obfuscation, that the scanners were not able to pick up the malicious code. So there's really strong evidence out there that you're really not going to catch much with these with this. We're really big proponents at VIA Forensics of secure app development and app security testing. This is code, this is software, and somewhere along the way, a lot of folks kind of lost sight of the fact that when you roll a mobile app, you're developing software, and part of developing software, as Microsoft learned the hard way over a number of years, is you have to have a secure software development life cycle. And that involves security in the design phase, developers who understand security concepts, and finally testing apps against a threat model to see if they meet the security requirements that have been established. And if anyone is putting out mobile apps, so if you're an organization that publishes a mobile app to the App Store, or for your partners, or you even use it internally to a certain extent, but if you haven't looked into security in the design phase and identified your risk, your threat model, and then leveraged experienced and trained development resources who understand secure development, and then tested your ultimate application against those security requirements, then you have that possibility of releasing something that is susceptible to man in the middle, or is storing the password in a local plist file without any encryption. So that's the first thing we recommend, and that's the sort of rising tide we want to see. We want to see all the apps out there from reputable companies and game developers and everybody be more secure. And any app that accepts a password or some personal data really needs to have a secure development lifecycle. Another emerging area that we're working on and see a lot of potential in is more behavior-based and multi-factor risk analysis. So instead of just trying to catch that one bit of code, we're looking at how you're using your device, what apps you normally use and where you use them, and where those apps are talking to, and whether your OS is secure, whether those apps are secure, and where those apps are talking to. Putting all of that together to identify the level of risk that you're dealing with at a given time. And not assuming that if you haven't caught a piece of malware that you're just, must be secure. And along those same lines, app behavior and network monitoring is something we've put into VIA Protect, where users can start to gain insight into where their apps are talking to and whether their apps are using encryption, HTTPS, when they send their data. Corporations, organizations are in some cases moving into software whitelisting, into app whitelisting. It's really challenging on mobile because of the consumerization, because of the BYOD approaches. It's really hard for most organizations to tell their mobile users, you may only install this list of apps. It's sort of a recipe for dissatisfaction, but it is, the only way that you can, to a certain extent, avoid lots of different kinds of apps of unknown provenance and security getting on devices. So if an entity, if an organization has higher security requirements, for instance, and believes that there could be sensitive data getting onto devices, and they really want to deal with the landscape of lots of vulnerable apps out there, then software whitelisting is one possibility that's supported by some different enterprise tools out there. And at the same time, you need to decide what apps you're going to whitelist. And an app being from a big name developer doesn't mean it's necessarily secure. We've got plenty of evidence to that effect over time. Finally, increasing data isolation. So the best way to protect data in mobile, or at least the most certain way, is to avoid sending that data to a mobile device. Obviously, that doesn't help you use and access such data from mobile. So isolation involves using encryption in apps to protect stored data. There are solutions out there providing corporate sandboxes and different ways to try to isolate your data and keep it in a secured container. And the balance there is always accessibility and user convenience against how much security you layer around the data you're trying to protect. So we really are trying to, in the mobile ecosystem, help users and organizations gain visibility into what's happening on the devices. We think it's really important to try to use up-to-date OS versions. There are a lot of vulnerabilities that have come out and been taken care of by the developers, by Apple and by Google, but you really have a much more secure posture in the newer OS versions, and there's even a hardware component when you look at Apple devices. Moving past the iPhone 4, for instance, substantially increases the protections that the on-device encryption provides. Limiting app installs, that goes back to the whitelist idea. This is something that end users themselves can do with education and just being informed consumers. We always caution people about Wi-Fi and about travel. Wi-Fi is, it's really convenient, but anytime you're using a unknown Wi-Fi, you're opening your traffic up to inspection. If your encryption is working in a given app, or you're using a corporate VPN, it could protect you from that kind of snooping. But as we've seen, there are a lot of apps that are not validating certificates properly, and some that simply aren't using HTTPS, and so you've got some risk exposure there when you use unknown Wi-Fi sources. So, going back to the original theme of the discussion, should you install anti-malware? Should you even run antivirus? Well, on Android, it's a hot debate. The product manager I think he's vice president with Google for Android, recently said he doesn't think so. He doesn't think it's necessary. There was a pretty big debate between him and some folks at Sophos who make antivirus for Android. We've got a link there. You can just Google Sophos and Ludwig, and you can decide for yourself. There's not much downside to running it. There's a lot of free tools out there, and they typically have some other features that may be useful, so we're not against running antivirus or anti-malware on Android, but we are against pretending that is the only security measure that individuals or corporations need. I mentioned Via Protect. That's a free app that we've got in the App Store, iTunes and Google Play, and so we encourage users to try it out, download it, and see whether their apps are using encryption and what countries the traffic is going to. In the very near future, we're going to be releasing app vulnerabilities that we find to users of Via Protect. We, of course, notify developers in advance and hope that they'll remediate those. But we think it's important that mobile users be informed of issues in both the operating system and the app as they use their device. So what we're trying to do with Via Protect is give users intelligence that they can take action on and make themselves more secure. So if I see in my Via Protect app that there's an app I installed that's not using HTTPS, that's not using encryption, I can protect myself immediately by uninstalling it. We recently found a major mobile email client was vulnerable to man-in-the-middle, and we notified the vendor, and within under 2 weeks they had released an updated app. And those are the kinds of issues we're going to point out to our users in case they're running an old version of that app and they haven't upgraded. And all of their email and their password for that email account are vulnerable if they're not using the up-to-date version of that app. And Via Lab is our solution for testing mobile apps for their security, and it's a great tool because you don't have to have source code, so you can test third-party apps as well as your own. And really exciting development in Via Lab. We are going to have a free version of Via Lab coming out in August of this year, and the free version is going to let people run close to the same assessment you can do with our commercial version. And test C is sensitive data being stored locally? Is the data going across Wi-Fi secure? And run some code analysis tests to see if the app is vulnerable on the device to things like path traversal or SQL injection into the SQLite databases, a bunch of other checks. So we're really excited to release a version that folks can try out and run for free and test their apps to see if they're secure. So a very common issue we see is storing of either sensitive data or secrets on the device. So there's sort of a misconception, I think, out there that because people can put a passcode and because Android and iOS have introduced forms of encryption, that somehow it's okay to store sensitive data in an app directory. And, to a very limited extent, yes, there are OS operating system controls on what apps can read on there. But as soon as you cross into sensitive things like passwords, or if you're getting into personal health information, or if you're in the financial space, if you're getting into to card data, payment card data, even account identifiers, you're really better not to store sensitive values like that. So you've got the sensitive data storage issue. The other thing is network encryption. Obviously, SSL is the longtime standard, or TLS as the standard is now called. And we see implementations where certificate validation is not working properly. That's the most common reason for man-in-the-middle vulnerability. How do you know if you're validating properly? Well, that goes back to that secure development lifecycle. If you haven't tested it to see if it's doing it properly, how do you know if it's doing it properly? You don't. So you have to be able to perform those tests, whether it's with Via Lab or hiring a security company to test the app, or using the open source tools that are out there to execute and try to hack your app on your own. You need to test that to see what happens when you execute a man-in-the-middle attack. Those are two really common ones. We also see other issues, Android debug flags and logging turned on, logging information locally that shouldn't be there. So I think that covers some of the most common issues. So Via Protect is targeted for the end user of the mobile device, and then at the organization level, if an organization goes with Via Protect at an enterprise level, the user can see what's on their device and what their risks are, and then that rolls up to an enterprise dashboard. So it's great for monitoring your risk score throughout the company and what's happening on devices. However, as much as we want to test every app we can and push vulnerabilities that we find, I don't think there's anyone out there yet that's found a way to scale to every single app published and at the level of testing that you can do with a Via Lab solution. So Via Lab is really the most in-depth security assessment you can perform, and it's going to really dive deep on the vulnerability of a given app. So if you're protecting your own enterprise, Via Lab, if you have analysts, and let's say you've licensed a third-party productivity software that you want to use on all your mobile devices, your internal analyst can use Via Lab to give it a really thorough assessment and understand, was this thing properly developed? Is it securing the data properly? Is it, when it authenticates, is it using encryption properly? VLab can help you do a really strong assessment in that area. Via Protect, you can do a more broad protection of your user base to ensure that you don't have devices running old OS versions, running vulnerable apps, sending data to countries you're not comfortable connecting to, and so on.